Season 6 Ranked has officially ended. In the top 10 Challenger ladder, Quas has been able to secure the rank 3 spot and the rank 8 spot. He's the only player to secure 2 top 10 spots in Challenger. One of the biggest reasons that he was able to secure this spot is with a new version of Nasus that has been going around that he calls Lane Pressure Nasus. What is different about Lane Pressure Nasus compared to old Nasus? Nasus has been about the same throughout his entire time as a champion. For the first 20 minutes of the game, you have one job: farm, 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 and farm. Getting those Q stacks is essential to becoming a late game monster. And once you hit late game and you have 600 or more stacks, you can one-shot those squishy carries with just one hit of your Q. Now this version of Nasus is definitely more simplistic, it is much more fun to play, and it can carry a lot harder. It also makes for some great YouTube highlight reels. But the biggest weakness of Stack Q Nasus is what's holding him back from ever being competitive on the Challenger ladder. And that is the same weakness that he has had throughout his entire span as a champion. You have to stack Q. That is your biggest weakness as a champion. Most champions in League of Legends max their Q ability first. Q is generally designed to be the most consistent, to deal the most damage, to have the lowest cooldown, and to be the easiest to use for most champions. Nasus is no exception. However, in the early game, you only get so many points per ability. You can't max every single ability. When you put points into an ability, you increase its base damage, and that is where most of the early game damage comes from in the majority of champions. If you're using the ability that you've been maxing only on the minions, then you can't use that ability to trade with other champions. This puts you at an inherent disadvantage to every single other laner, and this is why Nasus is considered so bad in the early game. Now, many lower elo players and mid elo players most of the time cannot properly punish Nasus for farming. They can't properly punish Nasus while his Q is down, and so they allow him to farm up and become this great monstrosity in the late game. In Challenger, where people are much more aggressive and much more prone to punish you for farming, Stack Q Nasus doesn't stand a chance. So there is a case to say that Stack Q Nasus is actually better in lower to mid elos because they don't punish you for farming. Stack Q Nasus carries harder because you actually deal a lot of damage, much more than Lane Pressure Nasus. So what makes Lane Pressure Nasus good? Here is a Stack Q Nasus farming out a wave. It takes him around 20 seconds to clear one minion wave. Here is what the other version of Nasus looks like. It only takes him a few seconds to clear out the entire minion wave. Granted, he doesn't get nearly as many stacks as the other Nasus, but he now has pressure on the top tower. He now forces someone on the enemy team to respond to him, otherwise they'll be losing minions and turret damage. By maxing E first in the early game, this version of Nasus is actually allowed to have an early game. This version isn't just constantly bullied around by every single champion he's playing. In some matchups where regular Nasus would pretty much always lose, this version can actually beat out the enemy lane opponent. Now, people have been calling this version many different things. Lane Pressure, ZZ Rot Nasus, Full Tank Nasus. My personal favorite is Quasis. But a more appropriate name for this version would be Come Camp Me Bitch Nasus. Stack Q Nasus hates it when the enemy jungler comes to camp him. This version of Nasus is practically begging for it. In the early game, you're constantly shoving up your enemy lane opponent. Spiritfire will outpush a majority of enemy top laners. This will result in a bigger minion wave for you. This will result in you hitting all your levels before the enemy champion. And this will also bait the enemy jungler to come and constantly camp you. One of the biggest reasons that Quas is so successful on this is because he continuously draws the enemy jungler and wastes his time in the top lane. He rarely ever dies, and when he does die, it's usually not for free. Top lane is a very isolated lane, and if you can draw a lot of jungle attention towards your lane and not give them kills, you're giving your jungler a lot of time to do other stuff elsewhere on the map. This is the biggest reason why Quasis is so good. So if you're not very good at dealing with jungle pressure, if you have horrible map awareness, if you don't remember to buy wards, then you probably shouldn't be playing this version of Nasus. In the mid game, this version of Nasus is extremely tanky. You should not be thinking of this version of Nasus as Nasus. You should be thinking of it sort of like a Maokai or like a Scion. Trinity Force and Iceborne Gauntlet are considered the two core items on regular stack Q Nasus. On lane pressure Nasus, in some games, you don't even purchase this item. Stacking Qs is not your priority. Your priority is pressuring your lane opponent. In most games that he plays, Quas ends the game at anywhere from 200 to 300 stacks. That is an amount that stack Q Nasus should have anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes into the game. This version sacrifices Nasus' core identity in order to make him more relevant and more tanky in the early to mid game. Now, if you're comparing the two versions of Nasus in the late game, obviously stack Q Nasus is stronger. The purpose of this version of Nasus is to have enough early pressure so that you can take objectives and help your team earlier on in the early to mid game. A perma-farm stack Q bot is not going to be very important. In the laning phase, this version of Nasus doesn't even try to stack his Q because his Q costs mana. This version, you're constantly just putting down Spirit Fires, constantly poking out your opponent. You start either Corrupting Potion or Doran's Ring for the mana sustain. Let's move on to items. This version of Nasus will either start Doran's Ring or Corrupting Potion as his first item. The mana sustain is pretty important so you can get more E-harass off during the laning phase. Once you go back, you should end up with Corrupting Potion and 2 Doran's Rings as your first purchase. Whichever ones you didn't purchase as your starting buy, you should be purchasing the others in your first back. The first item you should be buying is a tank item. Most of the time, you will be purchasing ZZ Rot Portal. ZZ Rot Portal is extremely important to continue the lane pressure and continue the pushing when you're not there. After finishing ZZ Rot, you should be going for a Spirit Visage. Spirit Visage makes Nasus extremely tanky. After that, you purchase tank items based off what the enemy team has, either Steric's Gauge, Randuin's Omen, Thornmail, or Guardian Angel. Trinity Force can be purchased, but it is generally purchased as a 4th or 5th item. Usually, you just want to be really tanky for your team. For masteries, this is the setup that you should have. Storm Raider Surge is too strong not to have on any version of Nasus. Even with a poorly stacked Q, you can still get off Storm Raider Surge fairly easy on this version of Nasus. Thunderlords might be effective in the laning phase, but Storm Raiders is much more effective throughout the rest of the game. Meditation is extremely important so that you can get back your mana so you can spam more E's into the laning phase. For runes, take armor or magic resist quintessences. Even though lane pressure Nasus has a decent early game, you're still Nasus and you're still abusable. You still need to be really tanky and you still need to be safe. Go health per level and scaling magic resist blues or scaling CDR blues. For marks, you can go either armor marks or attack speed marks. Thanks for watching the stacked Q Nasus versus the new version of Nasus. To watch some of this version in action, you can go check out Quas' stream in the description below. Until then, bye!